So good evening, everyone. It's a little after 7, so let's get going. My name is Dr. Charmaine McKissick-Melton, and I'm co-chair of the committee along with my colleague right here, Robin Kirk. And I want to make a few opening remarks, and then we will see about public comment. So as I've already said, welcome and thank you for coming for the committee. Thank you for serving. And let us also thank the county and the city for setting up this committee. We do want this to be a public, inclusive, and educational project for all, and put a high priority on gathering as much public information as possible. As you can see from our committee members, we have assembled an excellent group that represents a cross-section of our community, young and old, different races and genders from across the city and county. We expect our discussions to be passionate and energetic, but also expect civil and constructive comments. At every meeting, we'll have an invited speaker who's an expert on some aspect of the charge, and we'll also have time for public comment and committee discussion. Some meetings will be in these chambers, others will be in the community, primarily at some of the branch libraries, and we will include facilitators to better capture the opinions of all at those meetings. As a reminder, this is not a process meant to address the rights and wrongs of how the statute came down. Our charge is very specific and forward-looking and is meant to lead to a final report with recommendations. So the charge has basically 5 items. I'll read them. Number 1, engage the Durham community in an expansive and transparent public process regarding public monuments and other remnants of the Confederacy present in Durham. 2, propose to the County Commission a plan of dispensation for the Confederate monument torn down outside of the old courthouse, as well as the base of that monument that remains. 3, catalog all known Confederate monuments and other, quote, remnants of the Confederacy or the history of enslavement existing in Durham. And 4, propose to the City Council and County Commission, as appropriate, a plan for the dispensation of such monuments and remnants. Lastly, 5, in addition, the committee may choose at its discretion to solicit recommendations from the public for people, events, and locations that are missing from Durham's historical narrative to be recognized in future public efforts. So we thank you again for serving, and we look forward to hearing from diverse voices of the Durham community. Do you want to introduce? Quick introduction of all of our members. If we'll start at this end. Turn your mic on.
Good evening. My name is Dominique Walker. I'm a recent graduate from North Carolina Central University. I graduated with my Master of Public Administration. I'm currently a management fellow working in Bertie County, and I've been a resident of Durham for the past 4 years.
Hello, everybody. My name is Deandra Rose, and I'm a professor at Duke University. My work focuses on the relationship between higher education policies and the distribution of equal opportunity for marginalized groups.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Stephanie Ford. I'm a Durham-based filmmaker. I'm working on a series of short documentaries about the history of banking, and I do a lot of archival research.
I introduce myself, Dr. Charmaine McKissick-Melton. I'll try that again. Dr. Charmaine McKissick-Melton. I'm an associate professor of mass communications in North Carolina Central University and a native of Durham.
I'm Robin Kirk. I co-chair the Duke Human Rights Center, teach at Duke, and live here in Durham.
Hi, I'm Elizabeth Sappenfield. I'm a former president of Preservation Durham, which is the city's nonprofit historic preservation advocacy group. And I'm a North Carolina native, been in Durham for 10 years.
Hi, I apologize for being a few minutes late. My name is Barbara Lau. I'm the director of the Pauline Murray Project at the Duke Human Rights Center and the Pauline Murray Center for History and Social Justice. I do a little bit of teaching about Durham history and focus our work on connecting history to contemporary issues through community dialogue.
Hi, my name is Jacob Rogers. I'm the CEO of Triangle Community Coalition with a focus on land use policy throughout the Triangle. I've been a resident of Durham for about almost 5 years.
Hi, good evening. I'm Dr. Cynthia Greenlee. I'm a 19th century Southern legal historian, and I grew up in North Carolina in Greensboro and Asheville, but I consider myself a Durhamite. I've been here for about 18 years.
I just wanted to say we do have forms to fill out. If you're interested in commenting, we're going to do that after our presentation. So if you are interested in making a public comment, we'll have time for you to sign up and do that after our speaker. So Fitz, if you could come up. This is our speaker for tonight is Dr. Fitz Brundage, who's the chair of the history department at UNC. He's also written extensively about lynching, utopian socialism in the New South, and white and black historical memory in the South since the Civil War. His forthcoming book is called Civilizing Torture, an American Tradition, and traces debates about torture in the United States from the time of European contact to the 21st century. Thank you so much for coming, and please go ahead.
Thank you, and I want to thank all of you for undertaking what I'm sure is a time-consuming but very important task. I should say, since you all were commenting on your relationships to Durham, alas, I'm not a Durham resident, but I've lived in Chapel Hill for 18 years now. We who live in the Triangle move through one of the most densely cluttered commemorative landscapes in the state of North Carolina. So I'm going to talk a little bit sometimes about the Triangle, sometimes about the state, and sometimes specifically about Durham. The monuments in the three counties of Durham, Orange, and Wake alone account for nearly 15% of all of the commemorative monuments in the state of North Carolina. These three counties host not only a large number of monuments, but also some of the most conspicuous monuments in the state. One of the most conspicuous, of course, being the Confederate Memorial in front of the state capitol. A survey of the commemorative landscape of North Carolina and the Triangle reveal what has been memorialized, what has not been memorialized, and who has enjoyed the privilege of shaping our civic landscape. So let me begin by addressing the question of who erected the monuments that we see across the Triangle and the state. Commemoration was not a primary concern of public authorities. Voluntary associations assumed the task of crafting and disseminating historical memory. North Carolina had no tradition of state-sponsored cultural patronage until well into the 20th century. Even tireless pestering was unlikely to raise more than token funds from state or local coffers to subsidize monuments, statues, or other physical manifestations of historical memory that began to populate the North Carolina landscape during the late 19th century. Demonstrations of public support, however crudely generated and staged, established the authority of voluntary organizations to speak for the public. Consequently, voluntary organizations were keen to represent their campaigns as spontaneous expressions of popular enthusiasm and reverence. Let's see this. There we go. And I've just picked one image from neighboring Chapel Hill at the dedication of the monument that we now call Silent Sam in 1913. This was intended to be the physical embodiment of the kind of enthusiasm that was supposed to bring about the erection of monuments. Any organized group that could summon sufficient support and funds might influence public representations of the past. But an essential requirement for any group intent on erecting a monument was sufficient financial resources. The expense of even a modest monument placed a premium on fundraising, and especially fundraising from those with the deepest pockets. The Durham Confederate Memorial is a case in point. The expense of the initial planned monument exceeded the fundraising enthusiasm of Durham residents. Champions of Confederate memory in the city labored for years to arouse enough enthusiasm and to gather enough funds to erect the memorial. Julian Carr, that's another example, I'm sorry, of public enthusiasm intended. This is, of course, the monument we're talking about. I've obviously got these in wrong order. We will eventually see a picture of Julian Carr, the now notorious industrialist and tireless Confederate enthusiast, who grew increasingly frustrated with the community's lethargy in raising money for this monument. In most similar circumstances, Confederate memorialists would pare down their plans if they couldn't raise enough money. But here in Durham, a coalition of the local chapter of the United Daughters of the Confederacy and local Confederate veterans took the unusual step of appealing to the state legislature to allocate $5,000 to be raised by a 0.5% increase of all money, quote, raised by taxation from sources for a 1-year period of time. Julian Carr was asked to oversee the project, but he thought the appropriation of the monument should be at least $15,000, so he resigned in protest from the commission after he failed to persuade the Durham County Commissioners to ask the legislature to authorize a larger amount. In resigning, he complained that it would be a disgrace for a county as wealthy as Durham to erect a cheap monument. News reports suggest local politicians, quote, foresaw danger in asking for the larger amount, the $15,000 he wanted. What those dangers were was left unsaid. After Carr resigned, the United Daughters of the Confederacy attempted without success to get the amount increased or to find other funding. In the end, the Durham monument was a modest, off-the-shelf design from a Marietta, Georgia marble company. The reason why I linger on this is that the state legislature adopted any plan to fund the monument testifies to the power of Durham's local elites to harness public resources when private funding failed. That's exceptional in the history of monuments in the state and indeed in the South as a whole. Those white and black residents in the city who had displayed no enthusiasm or no evident enthusiasm to fund the monument nevertheless ended up footing the bill for the monument through their tax dollars. My supposition is the danger foreseen in news accounts was that local taxpayers would not tolerate more tax dollars being allocated for a monument that could not be funded through traditional voluntary methods. So the saga of the Durham monument underscores that monument erectors had to have access to those in power who could grant them permission to erect the monuments and accept them on behalf of the community. They also had to have access, in this case, to those in power who could get the state legislature to make these exceptional provisions to fund the monument. Typically, there was an informal approval process for monuments, except in those instances when the monument was of special importance. For example, those Confederate monuments that are on Monument Avenue in Richmond, D.C. There was considerable public commentary on those monuments. But otherwise, a group proposed the monument, got pro forma approval from the town fathers, and then proceeded to erect and dedicate the monument. This process seldom, if ever, elicited criticism, because local leaders were virtually always in sympathy with the groups erecting the monuments. In many instances, they shared family, business, or political ties. And when it was the UDC, it was often wives of prominent politicians who were the head of the local chapter of the UDC. Thus, for all appearances of the voluntary democratic tradition of public commemoration, the reality was only the most influential and well-heeled were likely to have the financial or political resources to add to the Triangle's commemorative landscape. This model of voluntarily funded commemoration created a landscape that was by design permanently exclusionary. A tally of who and what is commemorated in the Triangle underscores the narrow priorities of the groups responsible for the region's monuments. By my estimate, there are 127 monuments in the 3 counties that comprise the Triangle. Predictably, the overwhelming majority of monuments memorialize war, veterans, and male civic leaders. Nevertheless, by comparison to other regions in the state, the Triangle's commemorative landscape has become more inclusive than is typical elsewhere in North Carolina. I keep pressing the wrong button. This is my way of making a point about the diversity of monuments representing various groups in North Carolina. There are about 1,100 monuments in this state that we've identified. Of those 1,000 odd monuments, you can see there are 34 that depict African Americans as historical actors. I'm leaving aside highway markers. I'm talking about substantive monuments, memorials. So there are 34 that depict African Americans, 25 that depict women as historical actors. As you can see, American Indians. I included animals up there because it's striking that there are almost half as many monuments to animals as there are to women in this state. And I included furniture and household objects just as to sort of carry this to the ultimate extreme of ridiculousness. But let me return to the triangle. As I mentioned, out of those 1,000 odd monuments in this state, 127 of them are in the triangle. Nearly half of the state's monuments that honor African Americans are in these three counties. Here are three examples. 1/3 of the monuments that honor women are here in the triangle. And here are examples, and I would just point out that some of these examples, like the monument to Cheryl Sparky Alexander, is not an obvious monument most people encounter. And 1/10 of the monuments to American Indians, these two monuments, are in the triangle. But again, when we translate these percentages into raw numbers, the diversity of the local landscape is less impressive. So as I've said, 12 of the 127 monuments in the triangle represent African Americans, 6 represent women, 2 represent American Indians. Moreover, not only is the actual number of such monuments small, but also most of these monuments are much more modest in scale and much less conspicuous on the landscape than the monuments that commemorate wars or male leaders. And I point back to the Sparky, the monument on the right as an example of a monument that you could easily walk by and not even recognize it as a monument to a woman. So let me be clear that this exclusionary commemorative landscape didn't prevent African Americans from publicly expressing their distinctive counter-memory. Burdened by white repression and lacking resources or access to power comparable to those possessed by whites, African Americans in the Triangle couldn't erect elaborate commemorative landscapes until very recently. Instead, they invested in churches and schools, and these are sites of memory here in the area that represent exactly what I say, the African Americans investing in schools. I should say investing historical meaning in schools. And these are commemorative sites that whites never fully or seldom fully understood or even recognized. And they use celebrations to demonstrate to themselves and whites their version of history. So the calendar of black commemorative rituals in the Triangle included the celebration of Independence Day in the late 19th, early 20th century, which white Southerners weren't very keen on celebrating after the Civil War. Lincoln's birthday, which I can assure you white Southerners were not celebrating. Memorial Day, I mean the National Memorial Day, not Confederate Memorial Day, which African Americans celebrated. And of course, the highlight of the African American civic calendar, Emancipation Day. I don't have a picture of Durham's Emancipation Day, but this is this truly wonderful photograph of the Richmond Emancipation Day Parade in 1905. It's processions like this that provided an opportunity for African American community members and black veterans who were otherwise ignored on the landscape to be commemorated. Certainly no white Southern community was going to allow the commemoration of African Americans in monumental form without some form of protest. But I should point out the one notable exception. Now I'm leaving the Triangle momentarily for this truly extraordinary monument. It's one of the very few monuments erected by African Americans, in this case African American women, in Hertford, North Carolina, to Union-colored soldiers from the community. It's one of fewer than 10 that were erected in the South prior to 1990. It's the only one in North Carolina, and it's the only one south of Kentucky that was erected in in a public space. It's in front of the Black Baptist Church in Hertford, North Carolina, and a block and a half away from the UDC monument to Confederate soldiers. So this monument is a truly exceptional one, which, as I was saying, was raised by voluntary contributions by African Americans. To the present day, there is no monument to Black North Carolinians who fought in the Union Army in the Triangle. And only recently have veterans memorials erected in the region honored the service of Blacks who served in World War I or World War II. And so this landscape that I've described, the points that I wanted to emphasize, this is a landscape that was created by voluntary organizations claiming to speak for the public, but as I've tried to suggest, it was a very exclusive definition of public, and one that certainly did not include minority communities. And the second point was that the landscape that was created by these voluntary organizations is one that is extremely narrow in its representation of the historical experience of North Carolinians and certainly of the people of Durham. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Just to repeat for those who just arrived, we will have time for public comment. So if you are interested in doing that, we have some sign-up things, and I will just leave them at the end of the, we'll just pass them down here. Oh, hold on a second, Charmaine. And now maybe we can start, Cynthia, maybe just go around to ask questions one at a time. Do you have a question, Cynthia, that you would?
I don't have one yet.
Okay, so we will go around again. Jacob, do you have a question? Barbara?
Maybe a comment and a question. So I really appreciate the fact that you're trying to help us see some of this in a larger context. And what I'm trying to do is potentially even step a little bit bigger, just in the sense of the bigger idea behind monuments and memorials, and whether when we look at this 1,100 in the state, and then we think about nationally, whether most of these are associated with things like wars and large national events such as that, and when did that really begin to shift and we start to see monuments that relate to other kinds of movements beside these very sort of huge, often violent cases where we're really thinking about veterans?
The earliest, I'll use North Carolina that is an example broadly of national trends. Prior to the Civil War, there were almost no monuments in this state. To the extent that there were monuments, they were tied to the Revolution and George Washington. After the Civil War, the commemorative impulse obviously mounted directly because of the Civil War, and so in the late 19th century, Civil War monuments start going up at a blistering pace, actually. And then there's the Spanish-American War, so North Carolina put up monuments to that, then shortly thereafter, World War I, and so the cycle of wars. So that you're absolutely right. Up until the 1940s, the bulk of monuments in this state were related directly to war, one way or another. And even to the present day, of that 1,100, the rough number I'm giving you, out of that, roughly 900 deal with wars in one form or another. So it is still the overwhelming majority of the monuments that we have inherited. But I think during the 20th century, there were more and more monuments to, if you will, leading figures in the state's history. And then since the 1980s, we're in another sort of commemorative moment where across the United States as well as in North Carolina, since the 1980s, monuments have been going up at a faster clip than at any time since before World War II. And it's partially tied to wars, because we've been fighting wars for the last 20 years, more or less. And but there's also an effort to commemorate people who have been ignored previously, as well as movements that might have been ignored previously. But that shift really is a comparatively recent phenomenon. And if I was to use a national marker for it, in some ways, even though this monument's tied to a war, it marks a kind of fundamental shift in the idea of commemoration around the time when Maya Lin's Vietnam War Memorial was erected in Washington, D.C. There's an idea that you could grapple with not just heroic things, but also tragedy in monuments that was new to the vocabulary of monuments.
So that's perfect, the follow-up question. I mean, obviously, you've been thinking about not just why people do this, but what these things mean and what impact they might have on the folks who put them up, the folks who condone them, also just the general visitor that's going by. And it seems to me that the other thing that's really changed is that what things meant when we were just making sure perhaps that somebody wasn't forgotten, and what monuments mean today is also really different. And I think that's really germane to our conversation and thinking about this sort of evolving meaning of these objects. I mean, as someone who's worked in museums, I really understand that objects can mean many, many things. You can put a completely different label on a very same object, and it can mean completely different things. And so I also wonder if you could comment on sort of what your research has shown as the sort of evolving meaning or purpose of the monuments over time, just in your work.
I think you're absolutely right that the people who erected monuments, both now and then, typically want the monument to represent one thing. They would like to sort of fix it on the landscape for perpetuity. And we can understand all of the motivations why they would want to do that. But we also know that it's going to change because the context immediately around the monument may change itself, so the physical space, but also the meanings assigned to the symbols associated with the monument. So this is an issue where on especially symbols that acquire meanings that are divisive or are contrary to what some of those who originally created the monument would have wanted to have the monument acquire, becomes very challenging. So when these monuments were put up, they were intended to take, for example, a Confederate memorial. They had various audiences they were intended to speak to. They were intended to speak to the North, to tell Northerners that we are not embarrassed, we are not contrite, we are defiant. They were intended to speak, of course, to white Southerners who may not have supported the Confederacy, to tell them our memory is the dominant one. If you were a Unionist in North Carolina, tough. You're not, there are almost no monuments to Unionists in this state, even though we had one of the largest Unionist populations in the South. And if you were an African American, this is a powerful symbol that we fought this war to perpetuate the institution of slavery, to defend states' rights, to set up a slaveholders' republic. Don't you forget that. But now, since then, it's of course, since 2015, symbols of the Confederacy have acquired, for example, the meanings that Dylann Roof attached to them when he massacred people in a Charleston church. And some may want to separate those symbols from the historical actions that he undertook. But you can't do that. That's not to say that those symbols are responsible for his actions, but to say that he embraced them and gave them renewed meaning. So yeah, I think that's one of I think one of the most vexing things about monuments for people who want to freeze them in time. You can't do it.
Thank you.
Well, just to kind of continue that conversation a little bit, can you talk to some specific examples of evolving meaning and how communities have dealt with that in altering their monuments or adding other pieces to them, or we can do
yes,
things?
I can think of a couple examples. And I'm doing this on memory, so I might get some of the details a little off. But in Jacksonville, Alabama, which is in northern Alabama, north central, I guess, there was a community organization that came together about there were certain divisions in the community, racial and political, what have you, and there was a World War II monument, if I remember the details correctly, that only listed white soldiers from Jacksonville and the surrounding area who served in World War II. It completely excluded African Americans. And members of the community found common ground on the need to revise the monument to add the names of African Americans who served in World War II, that they should not be excluded any longer. So that would be a case where I suspect most of us would imagine that would not be controversial to do that. But nevertheless, it is an example where they revised a monument, which now, after the law that has been passed in Alabama, they could not do without state legislative authority, or approval, I should say. So that's a case of a community figuring out this is a legacy of segregation that we don't want to allow to continue any longer. I can think of another example, which is there are two examples where the UDC, who was responsible for erecting a Confederate memorial in Gainesville, Florida, as well as in Reidsville, North Carolina, took stands that suggested a kind of willingness to imagine different ways of honoring those monuments in the Confederate tradition. In Gainesville, Florida, as you may know, the community wanted to remove the Confederate memorial from in front of Public Square, and the UDC agreed to take possession of it again. They had paid for its erection, and they took possession of it and were responsible for preserving it on private space, in private land. The case of Reidsville is in slightly a sort of tragicomedy of a monument that was in a traffic circle that had been built in the age of horse and buggy, but it was hit 3 separate times by distracted and/or drunken drivers. And so the UDC decided after it was hit the last time, let's move this. And despite a lawsuit from the Sons of Confederate Veterans who claimed that the monument should not be moved to private space, it was eventually moved to a cemetery and restored by the United Daughters of the Confederacy. So again, those are examples of communities choosing to move and deal with troublesome, if you will, monuments. I'll leave it at there. Those are the ones that first came to mind.
This may be a quicker question. You mentioned Richmond and then memorials like this one in Hertford that are specifically to veterans. Do you see a substantive difference between a memorial to, say, Robert E. Lee or Jeb Stuart or what have you, and a monument to Confederate veterans, like rank and file veterans? Is there in terms of meaning or in terms of the things that you've been talking about, do you see a difference, or do you kind of see them now as very much the same kind of thing?
I think there can be a difference, but it can be, we would get quite granular here. Let me offer a continuum. You've mentioned, shall we say, a Confederate hero like Robert E. Lee, or let me use the example of Nathan Bedford Forrest. Nathan Bedford Forrest is the most commemorated Tennessean other than Andrew Jackson. There are high schools, roads, monuments to Nathan Bedford Forrest scattered across the Deep South, and they're particularly dense in Tennessee. We can ask ourselves why a man who was a duelist, a gambler, a slave trader, an irreligious man, is one of the most commemorated Confederate leaders. Really, he's the only person people who are more commemorated than him are Jefferson Davis, Stonewall Jackson, and Robert E. Lee. And as you probably know, Nathan Bedford Forrest was also the first Grand Dragon of the Ku Klux Klan during Reconstruction. So he's a figure who I would ask anyone who advocates the perpetuation of monuments indiscriminately to explain why we should have any monuments to Nathan Bedford Forrest in the 21st century. On the the other end of the spectrum would be a monument like the monument to the Battle of Nashville that the United Daughters of the Confederacy erected after World War I. It is a monument that is deeply influenced by the sort of sense of tragedy of war in World War I. And it's a very exceptional monument. It's a sort of monument, it's a lament about the destructiveness and tragedy of war. So there's a continuum. Most of the Confederate memorials in the South are well towards the celebration of the Confederacy and the Confederate cause, even if they are a memorial to Confederate soldiers who fought. So that's where I would pay attention to the text that is inscribed on the monument and the dedication speeches that were delivered when the monument was dedicated, to see what the commemorators intended the monument to commemorate. So I certainly do recognize that there can be monuments to Confederate dead which are analogous to a monument to Vietnam dead from Davie County or whatever county it might be.
Thank you for the presentation. I have several questions, and so in the interest of time, I'm going to ask you to answer yes or no.
Okay,
And
sure.
then one of the last ones is an open-ended question, but if you want to expound on your response after, that's fine.
Okay.
There's time. So are monuments and memorials representative of a people or a government's values and beliefs? Yes or no?
Some people's values, and yes,
Or government, if it's organized?
yes, that's what they're intended to be, yeah.
Yes, okay. Do you agree that the Confederate States of America was a white supremacist government?
Oh, yes, categorically.
Do you agree monuments and memorials to the Confederate States of America and its leaders are symbols of white supremacy?
Yes.
I don't know if I can read this. Would you agree that a government that erects a monument to the CSA, its leaders and participants, is a white supremacist government?
I'll offer one caveat.
Okay.
I could
Well, you can
imagine.
expound on that.
Right. I would say, broadly speaking, yes. The one caveat could be is I could imagine state funding for something at, say, Bentonville Battlefield that is intended to be part of a kind of historical education, if you will, that's not, and you might say, well, that's not exactly a monument, but that's where I'm not, so that's the only caveat I would say. Certainly, in the period of time when the vast majority of Civil War monuments in this state were erected, for example, from 1868 to 2000, the civic leaders who were in any way involved in the erection of those monuments were comfortable with white supremacy and white privilege.
Okay. Would you say the organizations like the United Daughters of the Confederacy and the Sons of Confederacy that are organized to commemorate their descendants of these individuals and commemorate their history, and the CSA, would you say those are white supremacist organizations?
Today,
Yes.
I wouldn't go that far. I'll explain there.
Would you say yes or no?
Oh, okay. I would say no then.
Okay. What would be the status of Black people today or African Americans if the CSA had won the war? You kind of already answered that, but
It wouldn't be good. It would be worse than it is today, I would think.
would you say immediately after the war we would have continued to be enslaved?
Presumably for as long as they could have preserved the institution.
And why should Black people value the preservation of Confederate memorials?
That's an excellent question. I mean,
That's the open-ended question.
I would say I would value them only. I would say they should be valued as historical artifacts, just like if you go to the there's various museums for the history of civil rights in Birmingham, Memphis, and elsewhere, Montgomery, the same reason you preserve signs for colored seating in a bus or colored water fountains, save it as a historical artifact to use to interpret the history of white supremacy and the oppression of African Americans. But as to why African Americans should want to preserve monuments as a form of commemoration, I think it's an excellent question as to why they should be preserved in that way, in that manner.
Okay, you don't have a answer to why they should or should not.
No, I mean, I would say the only reason I could see why they should be preserved is as historical artifacts.
Okay. And I'm interested in what you were going to expound on related to the sons and daughters of the Confederacy.
Well, I think the United Daughters of the Confederacy is an organization. I can only do this anecdotally. I have met daughters of the Confederacy who are quite open to all. I mean, they are members of an organization that say their mother or grandmother was a member of, and they would like to see the organization change in various ways, and they're quite open to all manner of changes. The Sons of Confederate Veterans is much different, and that's why I would draw a distinction between the, if you will, political social goals of members of the UDC as compared to the Sons of Confederate Veterans. The Sons of Confederate Veterans, especially in the 1980s and 1990s, flirted with, and one could say openly embraced, white nationalist and white supremacist alliances. And some of those, you can meet Sons of Confederate Veterans members who are still comfortable with those alliances to the present day.
Thank you.
So thank you again for that
Thank you.
presentation. So I was really intrigued by what you say about the messages that monuments have sent to intended audiences. And so I'm really curious about, for one, how various audiences responded historically to the monument's erection. So if, say, Northerners or African Americans in the South or other Southerners who did not support the Confederacy, is there evidence in the historical record that would suggest how they interacted with the monuments?
There are. As you would imagine, this was not, compiling that history was not something that whites in the South were likely to do very often. So there are different ways in which they acknowledged it. One of the most famous anecdotes about how African Americans responded to some of this commemoration is, of course, has to do with the monument to Calhoun in Charleston, South Carolina. It's still very conspicuous to the present day. It's now on top of a pedestal, which I think is 60 feet high or so, in Marion Square. It was one of the explanations for why it was raised up on the pedestal was because it was vandalized so often by African Americans. It was a favored spot for late night bathroom breaks and spitting and all manner of things. So the simple solution to that was to put Calhoun way, way up there where you can't do that anymore. So I can speak of other anecdotes where people, African Americans, have told me, or I've read of them, just being, what would be the right word? It's like if their daily life took them in front of Confederate memorials, there was a sense of kind of constant chafing. It's just there, and you know it's the rebel statue, and so it's not like they tried to topple it or something like that, but instead just the sense that it was a constant burr in their side. And I come back to this monument here in Hertford. It can't be, we know very little about this monument. It's something a lot of people are very interested in because it is such an extraordinary monument. But it can't be happenstance that this monument to Union-colored soldiers is erected a block and a half, roughly, from the monument that the UDC erected to our soldiers in Hertford. there's a dialogue going on between this monument and the other. And we don't have that in many communities for the obvious reasons that most African Americans weren't in a position to erect a monument like this. The final thing I would say is, the parade routes for Emancipation Day are really telling. African Americans didn't parade through the black community. That's what we might have thought they would do. They paraded, so for example, in a place like Columbia, South Carolina, even after they lost the right to vote, they paraded down to the state capitol grounds and around the state capitol, around the major government buildings, the major thoroughfares of the city. So there was a signal that they were sending that this is our city too. This is our public space. You don't want us here, but we're here. So I think there are a lot of ways where we can see that kind of resistance, if you will, to the dominance of the Confederate memory.
And just one quick follow-up. In terms of Durham, I wonder if you can speak to the relationship that citizens, I guess, across the board have had to the Durham Confederate monuments in recent years.
Well, I hesitate to speak to that directly, except to say that the shift to attention to monuments is, I think, part of an ongoing conversation across the South, with African Americans being concerned about the names on public schools. So, for example, Nathan Bedford Forrest High School in Jacksonville, Florida, for 30 years was an overwhelmingly majority African American high school. And you can well imagine what an insult that was, and finally in 2013 the name was changed. So the renaming of schools that had been named after Robert E. Lee, Jeb Stuart, Nathan Bedford Forrest, Jefferson Davis, that was a target, especially in the 1980s. The Confederate battle flag became a target, especially in the 1990s in Georgia, Mississippi, where it was incorporated in a state flag. So it's been a sort of ongoing effort to try to gradually tackle the most conspicuous emblems of this Confederate heritage. And so the monuments became particularly a focus in the last decade, but particularly after 2015 and now 2017 in Charlottesville.
Thank you.
Thank you again for your presentation. I just have two questions. Could you maybe expound on the voluntary organizations that took it upon themselves to fund the memorial or the monuments that were erected?
Sure. From 1868 roughly until 1890, most of the memorials to the Confederates were erected either by veterans organizations, even before the United Confederate Veterans was created as a veterans organization, and or by white women's organizations. They were called Ladies' Memorial Associations. So they were local voluntary groups. Then, with the founding of the United Confederate Veterans in 1889, there was now a region-wide organization that devoted itself to erecting monuments, among other things. And then in 1894, the United Daughters of the Confederacy was organized, and they really they took charge of erecting monuments and quickly superseded the United Confederate Veterans as the most ardent monument builders in the region. So these were regional, state-based voluntary organizations of white veterans and white women. And the United Confederate Veterans, as you would imagine, withered away as the veterans died. The Sons of Confederate Veterans didn't really exert much cultural influence or authority or have much membership. They were founded in the 1890s. They didn't have much membership until the 1970s. And so the Sons of Confederate Veterans is its recent history of cultural influences is truly recent. Meanwhile, the United Daughters of the Confederacy kept on with its work right through the 20th century.
Thank you. And you said in your presentation, you showed that I believe it was there are only 37 monuments commemorating African Americans in the Triangle.
There are 34 in the state.
34 in the state.
In the state. In the Triangle, the number, I can't remember, but I will find the number in the Triangle itself. In the Triangle itself, 12 monuments in the Triangle represent African Americans. And many of those, as you know, were erected quite recently, especially here in Durham. Durham is the single most important site of African American commemoration in the state.
Thank you.
To follow up on that real quick, okay.
We are running out of time for this segment.
Thank you. Sorry for my tardiness for the meeting. As a member of the Sons of Confederate Veterans, I joined in '92. I don't really know what happened before that, but we really tried to distance ourselves from any white supremacist, KKK, stuff like that. And just to have a note, we do have African American members too. But thank you for your time.
Is there anyone who would like to do, sorry, is there anyone who would like to have a public comment at this point? Okay, hold on just a second. Where did those things go?
They're right there on the desk.
Do I stay here? Oh. Okay.
So he's asking for us, not me, to speak louder so everyone can hear. Panel, committee, so speak into the mic, please. Thank you.
So Professor Brundage, if I could ask you one more question. Tom, yeah, just while we're waiting for people to sign up. You mentioned earlier, because I find this actually really interesting, the extent to the support of the Union within North Carolina, North Carolina being the last state to join the Confederacy. So I wonder if you could just share a little bit more about, well, what kind of numbers were we looking about? And I know Durham really didn't exist at that point, but sort of what the sentiment was at that point in this area, if that's something you can address.
Well, the Piedmont of North Carolina and Western North Carolina had large populations of white North Carolinians who either did not volunteer for the Confederacy. When they were drafted, they refused to serve and they hid out and tried to, or they joined and deserted as quickly as possible. It was also called the so-called Quaker Belt through here, so there were large numbers of religious dissenters. There were outright Unionists as well who were devoted to the Union cause, especially the further west you go, the more and more. We don't know exactly how many Unionists there were in the state, but roughly in the tens of thousands of white North Carolinians fought in the Union Army. And of course, there were also tens of thousands of African Americans from North Carolina who fought in the Union Army. And the final point I would make about the level of unionist support is in the 1876 gubernatorial campaign that ended up with Zebulon Vance being reelected as governor of the state. He had been the Civil War governor. Zebulon Vance beat a Republican named Thomas Settle, who campaigned in 1876 in part on the memory of the Civil War and Vance's role as the Confederate governor of the state. And Settle in his campaign brought up the punishment and the oppression of unionists at the hands of the Home Guard and Vance, et cetera. So I raise that as to remind people that Vance did win, but Settle came very close to winning. So there was a large reservoir of white North Carolinian sentiment that remembered the unionist historical experience.
Thank you.
I would just like to add to that, when North Carolina did vote for secession the first time, it was voted down not to secede, but was only agreed to secede after Lincoln called for volunteers to fight the other states.
Okay, thank you very much. Now we'll go ahead and have public comment. Our first speaker is Brenda Pollard. And by the way, 3-minute allotment, so I will be giving you hands up.
Is that a buzzer, or are you going to say something?
I'm timing with my phone.
Okay, I'm Brenda Pollard. I have lived in Durham for 33 years. It's an honor and privilege to be in front of you tonight and the service that you're providing. I want to share, this is a personal story for me. My great-great-great-grandfather, Fred Hill, was a Confederate soldier in Johnston County. He fought for what was then the beliefs that we're talking about today. He had courage, as many of your ancestors did. So I'm standing on his shoulders as I speak to you today. He had to bury, it was cold winter, they had to bury the quilts to survive. They had nothing. Everything was taken from them. The home place, it still exists, over 100 years now. He is buried there with my great-great-grandmother. I'm also, and it has no relevancy, but I am, and it has been proven, with documentation, birth certificates, death certificates, marriage certificates, 7 generations back, my ancestors fought in the Revolution. We've had a lot of wars. We've had a lot of people. We are a community of beliefs, and we can agree to disagree. My playmates were African American. I grew up on a farm. My blood is red and everybody else's blood is red. We're not chosen with the skin. It is God-given to us. Forgive my passion, but I had to come tonight because I know a lot of people in this room who loves this county, who knows that Durham County is the voice for North Carolina. Let's show some pride. Let's understand. And I have talked to people of all walks of life on this issue across the state since the monument came down in front of this courthouse. Some people are glad that it's gone, and some people are saying, let it stay. Why take it down? Why erase our history? It is who we are. We can be better. We are going to be better. On your state capitol grounds, I see that we talk about women's monuments. There is a monument for women there, and it's for the daughters of the Confederacy who put it there for the women. You understand, the men had to fight the war. The women had to take the farm and take care of the children and raise the crops and educate them. So women were there, as they are today. There's many conversations. We have removed flags. We have removed statues. We have stomped on them. We have spit on them. So what's next? Go out and dig up the bones? What are you going to do? We are a better people, y'all. Thank you for letting me have this moment. And thank you again for your service, and thank you for listening. Leaders are listeners. It's a very, very emotional matter, but we can be better. I believe in education in our students. And let us educate. Let's don't just, we can't remove who we are.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. The next speaker, I'm trying to have difficulty reading your name. John? John, could you state your last name so we can make sure we have it for the record?
Sure. I'm John Lloyd. One of my concerns tonight is that we may be trying to rewrite history rather than improve the future. Durham has a long history of inclusion and people working well together. I personally experienced the merger of the Durham City and County school systems merging together, and there was quite a bit of stress with that. I'm a small business owner. One of my concerns is the amount of time that the members here have been Durham occupants, since this is really an issue of the culture of Durham. I've been here 45 years plus. I heard a number of people saying they've only been here for a couple of years. So that means you need to work extra hard at understanding what Durham is about. The largest surrender of the Civil War happened in Durham at Bennett Place. The Union soldiers were in Raleigh. Confederate soldiers were in Greensboro. Bennett Place was halfway in between. That's the only reason it was actually chosen, but it did happen here. In the sense of rewriting history, the city of Durham's official seal is 2 tobacco leaves. We've adopted a flag with colors and stars and an explanation for that, and that is a symbol, but the official seal is still 2 tobacco leaves. We're a community that was originally built on tobacco, and I don't think we need to deny that, but learn from it. I'm not suggesting people take up smoking that aren't smokers, but what built this community? If it weren't for tobacco, we'd probably be somewhere else. And so I actually, as a former Durham City Council member back in the 90s, thought that the tobacco leaves symbol represented us well. I think tobacco built Duke, and you can't even smoke in the parking lots at Duke anymore, if I'm not mistaken. So, I mean, I almost missed my second child's birth because I was trying to find a place I could have a cigarette. But anyway, my point is that we are big people. We can make this a matter of inclusion, not exclusion. History is history. I think everybody in this room probably has something in their past they wish they could go back and do differently. But it's history. We learn from our mistakes. We don't try and deny them. So all I ask is that we work together with this and not try and deny Durham's past, but try and improve it. I think the statement that Durham has the most African American and statues for women and those things makes my point. We are going in the right direction if we don't slip backwards. Thank you.
Thank you. Barry?
Evening. My name is Barry Archer. I'll be speaking towards monuments, I guess. Monuments are icons, of course, and all icons are used to send messages. The messages that we, as a state or as a city or as a community together send should be very, what's the word I'm looking for?
Barry, you can hold on 1 second so we can actually hear you.
Right on.
Yeah, hold on 1 second. And lift the mic a little closer so everybody can hear you well. Okay.
Am I good now?
Go ahead.
All right. Okay, I'm speaking towards monuments. Monuments are icons, and all icons are used for communication. And so when you're building a monument or using an icon, you are sending a message. The messages that you send can send fear. The messages shape people's emotions. They change people's emotions. And what I'm speaking towards is as far as the future is concerned, if we're going to have monuments up, we need them to be very inclusive. We need them not to send dissonance into our society, which is what several monuments can do. Some of them make you feel pride, but sometimes that pride that you have can be a negative pride. So all I'm saying is, as far as monuments and icons are concerned, we have youth and people from all types of areas. And when they see a symbol, it affects them differently. So we have to be very clear, we have to be very concise on what type of a message we want to send as a community. I'm sending a message, I'm wearing a Durham shirt with a Durham hat, and I'm talking about all of Durham. I'm not talking about black Durham or white Durham or Spanish Durham. I'm hoping the message I'm sending with this monument here is that I love Durham. And I would hope that any monument that we have in the future, even the ones that we have from the past, that we can change them to add more information on them. Because I would like to see, that part of history is true, how women stood up. And it is overshadowed by a lot of negative stuff. So if we're going to have monuments that are erected, can we add information that includes everyone and it projects a message of safety? Because icons, you know, and psychologically they really mess up people's heads when they see something. You know what I'm saying? And so we have to think of that while we're shaping our futures. Thank you.
Thank you. Gary Foreman?
Good evening. Last summer, I was fortunate enough to talk my 2 teenage granddaughters into going to Gettysburg with me. And I even got to take them up to Little Round Top, only because there was a parking area and they didn't have to walk too far. And I was able to show them with the intensity that we all should remember that that flag wouldn't be here if it wasn't for Joshua Chamberlain and the Maine troops, the top of Little Round Top, who were countered by the Alabama troops coming up from below. And fortunately, it worked out like it did in those 19 minutes, I think it was all there. So I got to impress all these things on it. But my 17-year-old was asking the questions about Confederate monuments and the like, and I said, well, we'll look into that. A good test would be, how many monuments are there in Maine who really saved the Union? That flag wouldn't be here in Maine now if it wasn't for Joshua Chamberlain in the 20th. And how many monuments are there in Alabama? And Wikipedia gave us a figure of 16 in Maine and 135 in Alabama. So I didn't know how to resolve that. And I see this points to the talk that I could hear. I've seen the graphs from the Southern Poverty Law Center showing the offset of time, memorials being raised and planted of about 40 years, and how they peaked. And what I just told you was seems to be a very in-your-face political statement, with Alabama having 130-some monuments and Maine having 12. But the other thing that struck me at Gettysburg, as I'd spent some time there, is there really is a lot of memorials there to both sides, and the dates of them being put there are very different, and in that period also. So my wonder is, if we're going to make these comparisons between state to state and political, it would seem, I don't know if there's any study about major battlefields and what the digression and the progression of memorials as they were put in place there. It might be very telling, with places like Gettysburg and Shiloh being kind of neutral areas for both Union and Confederate troops. I'd like to see that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Abigail.
Thanks, everybody, for being here. I appreciate what I've heard. I want to say that I'm not from Durham. I chose to come to Durham a year ago, and I love Durham. One reason we chose this area is because we saw it as a blue place in a red state, and I don't apologize for that. We wanted to be in a progressive area. And I think that this is personal for everyone. You don't have to be from Durham to have this be personal. I think it's highly personal. And I'm going to say something you don't hear a lot of old white women say. I'm going to say that I think it must be incredibly personal to be a person of color and walk by a monument to something that is nothing but a war that was fought for the right of one human to own another. And that's what that was. And yes, that is history. But make no mistake, that's what the Civil War was. We don't honor all of our history. We don't forget it. We should learn about it. We should be taught what it was, what it meant. Some of it needs to not be repeated. So we need to know about it. We don't have to honor it. We know about Duke tobacco. We don't have monuments to black lung and cancer. We don't have monuments to those things. We can know that women were oppressed, but we don't have to have monuments to sexism. There's nothing more heinous in our society than slavery. There's a lot of heinous things, but nothing more than that. When I was young, our parents took us to Richmond to see all there is there about the history of the Civil War. And we weren't told what it meant. And we thought that it was glorious and heroic and beautiful and exciting and just vim and vigor and valor and all of those wonderful things. And I didn't know what it was. I didn't know what it meant. And now I know who Robert E. Lee was, and I'm sure he was a strong man, but I know what he fought for, and I don't honor him. I think if folks need to see history, they should go to the museums. That's what my husband and I do. We go to the museums, and I think Gettysburg's a great place. We've been there and we walked it. But that's where monuments belong. You go to a place to see monuments. You don't see them on the street and have no little child like me growing up now in this day and age thinking that those folks were on the right side of history. Because what they fought for was an abomination. We can't afford to have that in our society today and have folks like Dylan Roof get it in their heads that they have present day behind them. History needs to be behind us. And I hope that's where Durham puts it.
Thank you. Thomas Beach.
Good evening. My name's Tom Beach. I've lived in Durham for about 30 years now. I'd like to talk a little bit about patriotism and heritage. My fourth great-grandfather, Benjamin Kidwell, was in the 3rd Maryland Regiment of the Army of the Colonial Army. His son, Jesse Kidwell, rode a horse with a guy named Francis Marion down in South Carolina. Francis Marion was known as the Swamp Fox, and he invented guerrilla warfare. So he waged little skirmishes against the British and the Hessians. My second great-grandfather was Philip Samuel Beach. He joined the Confederate Army when he was 41 years old. They assigned him to an artillery unit because he was a laborer. His son, my first great-grandfather, Charles Thaddeus Beach, he was in the infantry of the Army of Northern Virginia. My grandfather, on my mother's side, came from Czechoslovakia at the tender young age of 7 years old, and he enlisted in the Army and fought in the First World War. My father, Aubrey Beach, he fought in the South Pacific. He enlisted, he was drafted, and actually his professors in high school begged the Selective Service to leave him alone until he graduated. He graduated on a Friday, and on Saturday he was on a bus going to Illinois. He was in the South Pacific. He was in the Naval Air Corps. My father, he spent like 4 years in the reserves, and about a month before it was all up, he was taken back in for the Korean conflict. As you can see, I probably couldn't make it in the Army or the Navy or the Air Force. They wouldn't take me. But I'm telling you, patriotism runs deep in my veins. In the American Revolutionary War, there was a lot of loyalists, and they accused people like my fourth and third great-grandfathers as being traitors and terrorists. They were patriots, just like my second great-grandfather and just like my first great-grandfather. And by the way, I found an artillery unit of reenactors, and they reenact for Stribling's light artillery, and I joined them. And yes, I can fire a Civil War cannon, and have done it several times, both as a Confederate and as a Union. You see, I love history, and I love the fact that we can celebrate differences, and I love the fact that heritage means a lot to a lot of folks down in the South. I have a bumper sticker that says heritage, not hate. Thank you.
Thank you. That concludes our segment of public comment for this evening. And the body needs to have a couple of conversations. Where shall we start? Do we want to talk about the meeting next week?
Yeah. We have been talking about our next meeting, which is scheduled for June 21st, but a fair number of people are not able to attend. So we have been have taken sort of an informal poll about whether we should continue with the plans for the meeting or reschedule. And we're trying to find a new time to meet at the Rougemont Ruritan Club, but their schedule is a little packed. So I just wanted to poll people and see what they thought about either sticking with that June 21st date, about 6 of us can go to that, or changing that date to a different date and trying to coordinate with people's schedules. So what do people think?
I think
We're talking about the date that's only a couple of weeks away, which is June the 21st.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. I think if 6 of us are not going to be able to be here, I don't really see much value in the entire committee meeting. So I'm fine with rescheduling that to a later date.
Yeah, we're only a body of 12 when we're full, so.
Right. That's not even a quorum.
I tend to agree that we should move it.
I'm flexible, I can do either.
I'm flexible. I'm agreed, and if we reschedule, though, I would like to make sure that we have it in another part of the community, and particularly a more rural part of the county, if possible.
And now we just have any other concerns? I mean, we still have Dr. Brundage still here. If people have additional, I know that maybe Liz had a question. Stephanie, if you have additional questions, I don't know if people wanted to take advantage. We have about 10 more minutes.
I would like to bring up a point. It's been said that when the statues, at the time that monuments were put up, there was a gap. The majority of the monuments were put up at the 50th anniversary and the 75th anniversary of the war. That was one of the major reasons also.
I would like to ask, do you agree with the arguments and position that removing the monuments specifically is removing history or trying to erase history? And can you list the other ways that, I mean, some of them are obvious in books, et cetera, that history, specifically the Confederate history, is preserved?
Just for, yeah. You can come back.
Sorry.
Sorry.
You're the ping pong ball.
Do you agree with the position that removing the monuments specifically is an effort to erase history and forget about the past? And what other ways are history and specifically Confederate history preserved? I know some are obvious, but books, et cetera, but are we really removing and erasing history just by removing one monument?
I think there's a big difference between history and commemoration and between a monument and historical knowledge. If monuments taught history well, we would be a very historically literate society, and there's ample evidence that that's not the case. I think, as one gentleman said, monuments have a way of distilling history down to very simple ideas and perpetuating those simple ideas as opposed to the complexity of human history. Communities have dealt with unwelcome monuments since, I'm sure, the very first monuments went up. Ancient Egyptians had a way of dealing with this. They chiseled off the names of pharaohs who had fallen out of favor. They left the name so you could work out who it was that was erased, but they made it clear that this person was no longer to be honored. We have a phrase, iconoclasm, that comes back from what the Calvinists did, particularly in the Low Countries of Europe during the Protestant Reformation, where they destroyed Catholic icons. There have been the Romans, ancient Romans, destroyed monuments of people who had fallen out of favor. So this has been going on throughout human history. In my own preference, as I've said, would be to preserve some monuments. Communities would decide which monuments that are historical artifacts. There would be other monuments that a community might decide it can go to the dust heap of history. That's not going to erase the history. It's going to remove the monument.
What other organization? You said it was the UDC and a coalition of the UDC and another organization that petitioned. I don't know if you're talking about a monument in Raleigh or the one.
Oh, the monument in Durham. It was actually not Sons of, it wasn't, my understanding was not the Sons of Confederate Veterans in Durham or the United Confederate Veterans, but instead a local veterans organization that worked with the UDC to try to get funding for the Durham monument.
Okay.
Those kind of alliances often happened in communities where whatever Confederate memorial organizations existed, they would try to work together. Although the UDC was much, much better at raising money than the United
We don't know
Confederate
the name
Veterans.
of the other organization, or you don't have?
Here in Durham?
Yeah, the organization at the UDC.
I could find that out for you, but I don't remember it right now.
Okay.
We have who put the monument up in the paperwork that was sent out by Robin is in that, the organization.
Oh, the two, okay.
Because you've been involved in the commemorative landscape site, I think that might be online in that Doc South. Anyway, I'll send around the link again, but that's a very comprehensive listing of, as William said, a very comprehensive listing of who built the monument, who funded it, all that kind of stuff.
I've got it right here. If
Yep, do you want to go ahead and, you can read it out.
Yep. It was sponsored by the Robert F. Webb Camp, Colonel Robert F. Webb Camp, United Confederate Veterans, Julian S. Carr Chapter, United Daughters of the Confederacy, and the citizens of Durham County.
Oh, okay, so it was the UCV. I'd forgotten that.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, William.
Well, I just want to say the comment that you made, that it was important to understand that one of the ways that we understand the monuments is to look at what the inscriptions are and also the speeches that are given upon their dedication. So I think it would actually be really good for our group to include the speech, the transcript of the speech in the sort of documentation that we're building in our Google site, so that we all can also reference that and get a better sense of the meaning ascribed to this statue when it was put up.
To follow up on your response a minute ago about the limitations of commemorative monuments and how simplistic their meaning tends to become, I wanted to kind of ask two different questions. What's the virtue of commemorative monuments? And what are the better ways of teaching public history?
I realize this is an easy example, perhaps, but nevertheless, I think the Lincoln Memorial is an example of how a monument can not only have tremendous meaning when it's created, but it can acquire more and more and more meanings over time. The fact that the Lincoln Memorial has within it two of Lincoln's most poignant speeches inscribed, so you can read his words, and they're, I think, some of the most eloquent words in American public discourse, means that you can be taught by that monument what it was intended to convey. But in addition to that, that was, of course, has been the site where Marian Anderson gave her performance after the Daughters of the American Revolution refused to allow her to perform as a black woman in Constitution Hall. And of course, it was the site of Martin Luther King's own I Have a Dream speech and other events. So it has acquired all of these other meanings associated with American values. And I think another one on the Mall in Washington, D.C. is, of course, Maya Lin's monument, which is, every time you go there, you see more people who have used it as a site of personal commemoration, and that's very moving. So those are examples of sites that seem to have this ability to continue to speak to people on multiple levels. There are other monuments, whether due to the limits of the aesthetic ability of the creators or the vision of the creators, have much less capacity to evolve, if you will, to acquire meanings, and instead they are either static or else they can become divisive. That's where it's very simplistic to say there's some monuments that really do work and grow, and there are others that don't. The second question you asked me, I've forgotten.
Is about how we teach public history.
Oh, how we teach. I think, let me say, one of the reasons why I think some monuments can be appropriately preserved as historical artifacts is because if they're put in the right type of space, they can be used very effectively to teach a lot of history. So at some future date, I hope Silent Sam is moved to a historical interpretive space where the University of North Carolina can use that monument to teach its history, not only of why the monument was erected, but also why there was student opposition to the perpetuation of that monument for decades, since the 1960s. It can be a useful tool to teach that history. I think also a gentleman mentioned Gettysburg. Gettysburg is such a powerful landscape in part because it has so many monuments that help us to view the space historically. If it weren't those monuments, we would just have to sort of use our imagination to try to figure out where things happened. But monuments can be very useful at organizing information in physical space. And so in that regard, I think they can be useful, but a battlefield is essentially a giant open-air museum. A public square in front of a courthouse, for example, is not an open-air museum. It's civic space. People are using it for lots of things. Many of them don't have the time to stop and linger to try to figure out why this thing is there, occupying that privileged public space. So that's where I would divide. There are certain places where public history can be very well taught. In other places, you have to be very careful what's going to populate that space.
Well, thank you. We're at time now. Thank you, Fitz, and thank you everyone who commented and everyone who came. We have a Facebook page that you can follow for events and for our information, also a Twitter feed and an email. Feel free to contact any one of us for that information. And we really appreciate everyone coming tonight.
One last point of order. When we reschedule the June 21st meeting, we will let the public know. But right now, the next meeting, because we have the month of July off, will be August the 7th. At Southwest Regional Library. Thank you so much. Have a good evening. Thank you all for coming. Committee, thank you for your work.
Thank you so much. It was really a very